Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Spent some time yesterday afternoon kind of just thinking about some of the biggest storylines that we've seen in college football over the last couple of months. And I don't think there's a bigger storyline than what Kalen DeBoer has done with this Alabama program on the recruiting trail. And I think it's big for two different reasons. One, you look at Alabama, you make no mistake about it. It's one of the premier, biggest brands that we see in all of college football. But I think more importantly, you go back to Kalen DeBoer when he took the job at Alabama. One of the biggest question marks we had was, what can he do on the recruiting trail, right? There wasn't a single college football fan, or at least a college football fan that knew what they were talking about, that questioned if Kalen DeBoer was a good head football coach or not. And its proven track record over the last 2 decades certainly shows you that as a pure football coach, and Kalen DeBoer is one of the best in the country. I think the big question was, can he come to the SEC at a program like Alabama and recruit at the level that you need to in order to compete for SEC championships and win national championships? And I think the last 6 months has been a resounding yes for Kalen DeBoer. And you look at Alabama, if there were any question marks about where this program would be going post Nick Saban, I think the last 6 months, and Kalen DeBoer has certainly answered those questions. Want to get into what Alabama's done on the recruiting trail, but more importantly, where they're going on the recruiting trail. A fascinating story, at least in my mind. Before we get into it, as always, just want to say thank you to you guys, to the Alabama fans. It's been a blast covering this program on the recruiting trail over the last couple of weeks. The amount of support you guys have shown truly does mean a lot. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. And without further ado, let's get into this one. Now, before we get into some of the big names that Alabama is currently trending for, I want to talk about what Kalen DeBoer has done up until this point. I think it starts with quarterback Keelan Russell, who's a guy that we said this when Keelan Russell flipped his commitment to Alabama. I am very confident he's going to finish as a 5-star come signing day. I mean, you look at what Keelan Russell just did last week, went out, won the Elite 11. I think more importantly, 24/7 Sports just kind of missed on the evaluation. And you take a look at the numbers that Keelan Russell put up his junior year at Duncanville in Texas. It was really confusing why he was outside of the top 100 nationally. And within the last couple months, they've just been slowly bumping him up. And I don't see how he takes a step back after winning the Elite 11. I mean, you locked in one of the best quarterbacks that we see in this 2025 cycle. But I think what stands out to me even more than the quarterback, because again, we had this conversation. We were pretty confident that Kalen DeBoer could recruit the wide receivers, recruit the quarterbacks to Alabama with the track record he has in terms of developing those kind of positions. I think the biggest question we had is, can you go head to head with programs like Georgia and Kirby Smart or Auburn and Hugh Freeze for line of scrimmage players? And you look at what Alabama has done on the offensive line. That is really what stands out to me. We talked about Micah DeBoer yesterday morning being, one of my favorite offensive linemen, a guy that can play tackle, can play guard, but at the end of the day is one of the most physically imposing offensive linemen we see in this 2025 cycle. You land Jackson Lloyd from the state of California, who is just that prototypical offensive tackle. And we kind of said, I have a hard time seeing Jackson Lloyd not being kind of a multi-year starter at the offensive tackle spot. And then Michael Carroll, a guy that, again, similar to Micah DeBoer, I think has the athleticism and frame to play offensive tackle, but also can kick into guard. You look at Micah DeBoer and Michael Carroll, two guys that you went head-to-head with Kirby Smart in Georgia, multiple other SEC and Big Ten teams, and landed some of the premier offensive linemen that we saw in this 2025 cycle. And I think the kicker here is, I don't think Alabama's done on the offensive line. I mean, they're trending for 5-star offensive tackle Tai Haywood from the state of Texas. And, man, you look at Tai Haywood, one of the things that I love most about Tai Haywood, he's a high floor, high ceiling kind of player. And what I mean by that is the floor is extremely high. I don't see Tai Haywood being a washout at the SEC level. I don't see him even not starting multiple seasons for Alabama or whatever program that he chooses. But I think what makes him even more special, and you rarely say this about high school prospects, is, yeah, they have a high floor. They're going to be really good, but they also have a really high ceiling. And you look at Tai Haywood and say, this is a guy that could be a top 5 NFL draft pick in a couple of years. And you look at why you kind of see that and say 6'5", 285, that is probably the ideal frame for a high school prospect at the offensive tackle position, can comfortably get up to 315 pounds, has extremely long arms, plays with extreme athleticism, carries the weight exceptionally well. I look at Tai Haywood and say, not only a guy that's going to be a multi-year starter for Alabama, but a guy that could be one of the best offensive tackles in the country over the next couple of years. And if you do, in fact, land Tai Haywood and you have a guy like Jackson Lloyd on the other side, and then you're allowed to kind of kick Micah DeBoer into that guard spot where I think we all agree that's his best position at the collegiate level. You have Michael Carroll. I look at this Alabama offensive line and say, this is going to be one of the best offensive lines that we see in the country over the next couple of years. Not to mention, they still have a guy in Caden Proctor who's only going into year 2 within this program. I look at the biggest storyline within this Alabama recruiting class and say, it's the offensive line and what Kalen DeBoer has been able to do along the lines of scrimmage. Now, there's also a lot of other names that Kalen DeBoer, Alabama, are trending for. And of course, he's in it for some top wide receivers, and you saw him do it with Ryan Williams in the 2024 class. Decommits, gets Ryan Williams back into the fold. Again, Kalen DeBoer, he carries a lot of weight with wide receivers. When you put in 3 wide receivers to the NFL like he did last year at Washington, these kids want to go play for Kalen DeBoer. You look at Caleb Cunningham, and seemingly out of nowhere, Alabama's the leader for another 5-star prospect in Caleb Cunningham from the state of Mississippi, a kid that we've talked extensively about. One of the things that kind of stands out to me about Caleb Cunningham is he might satisfy that kind of wide receiver that we're not necessarily sure Alabama has. Now, I think Caleb Odom can be that kind of guy. Was originally saw as a tight end. Sounds like he's going to play wide receiver for Alabama, a guy that's going to be just special as a pass catcher during his career at Alabama. But you look at Alabama and say, a lot of guys that can create some separation, operate after the catch. Do they have some of those big-bodied wide receivers that can win vertically down the field? Caleb Cunningham would be that kind of guy. And you look at Caleb Cunningham and the physical traits that he has. He's an elite basketball player. That shows up on the film. He's got a really nice frame, but more importantly, the body control, how comfortable he is going up and making plays on the football. You probably don't see a wide receiver in this 2025 class that is as good at the catch point than Caleb Cunningham. And we always talk about how you want your wide receiver room to almost mimic a basketball team, where you have wide receivers that excel at different kind of things. You look at Ryan Williams, one of the most electric movers that we see in all of college football going into his freshman year. Caleb Cunningham would be that kind of wide receiver that he's not going to be the electric mover, separator, yards after the catch kind of guy that Ryan Williams is going to be. But Caleb Cunningham is going to be that physically imposing boundary wide receiver that can just go up and make plays. And so it sounds like Caleb Cunningham potentially trending to Alabama. That's another massive storyline for this Alabama program. And we're not done with the 5-stars. You talk about 5-star cornerback Daon Lee from the state of California. It sounds like Alabama in a really good spot for him as well. Believe he commits at the end of the month, and I cannot wait to break down the film with you guys with Daon Lee. This is a guy that at 6'4", 190 pounds is so physically imposing at that cornerback spot and can do so many different things. He is elite sitting there in zone coverage where he's just super long. He's twitchy. He can read the quarterback's eyes and go make plays on the football with the length and size that he has. But he's also a guy that can play up on the line of scrimmage, use that length to just get his hands on wide receivers and just kind of control them off the line of scrimmage and press man. And so this is a quarterback that you can do so many different things with. And on top of that, I think he could be a pretty damn good safety as well. Because you start looking at this Alabama secondary room with some of the guys that they brought in the 2024 class and say, Xavier Brown, looks to be a year 1 starter for Alabama. Jalen Mbakwe probably will need a year, but freaky physical traits with that kid. Xavier Mincy. Now you add a guy like Daon Lee who can play the cornerback spot, can play the safety spot. You start looking at what this Alabama secondary is going to be come 2026, 2027. It is going to be one of the better units that we see in the country, along with the offensive line. I can't tell you how impressed I am with, what Kalen DeBoer and the staff are doing outside of the quarterback and wide receiver position. And the last guy on defense that I want to talk about, who again also trending to Alabama, Dawson Merritt. one of the just modern era linebackers that you're looking for, kind of like Daryl Johnson, who's already committed to Alabama, where you look at Dawson Merritt and say, this kid can do so many different things within this Alabama defense. He can play that off-ball linebacker spot, go sideline to sideline, cover a lot of ground, and operate in the tackle box. He's also a guy that can come off the edge. He can play that overhang linebacker spot where you ask him to drop back in coverage and be an athlete in space. You look at what we need from linebackers in this modern era of college football where they're forced to operate in space, drop back in coverage, tackle in space. You need premier long athletes. Dawson Merritt is that kind of guy. He plays all over the field at the high school level. Will probably need a year coming from small school Kansas football to the SEC, but a guy that, I mean, this is exactly what you're looking for in these linebacker prospects coming out of high school. And you look at Alabama and say they have the number 2 class in the country. They're trending for multiple 5-star prospects, a few other top 100 prospects. What Kalen DeBoer is doing on the recruiting trail is one of the biggest stories in college football, because again, the biggest question we had about Alabama was not only what does it look like post Nick Saban. When you bring in Kalen DeBoer, you know he's going to maximize the talent on this roster. The question was, can he get it done on the recruiting trail? Again, Alabama fans know this more than anybody. You have to be able to recruit at a baseline level to compete for national championships. It doesn't matter how good of a coach you are. If you don't recruit the premier athletes, you're not going to be competing for SEC championships and national championships. We knew Kalen DeBoer was a great head football coach. We didn't know what he could do recruiting at Alabama. We are getting our answer. Massive storyline that's cooking up in Tuscaloosa that not a lot of people are talking about because not a ton of college football fans follow the high school recruiting trail. But for those Alabama fans that follow the recruiting trail, massive, massive storyline for Alabama. Extremely impressed. I was one of the doubters. I've been proved wrong. Kalen DeBoer crushing it. We'll cut it there. Appreciate you guys rocking with the fellas. Again, if y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Appreciate you guys, and we'll talk to y'all later.